Let's talk about the posterior pituitary and the effect of the hypothalamus on it. So let's get on with it. Now, in contrast to the anterior pituitary, the posterior pituitary is directly affected by the hypothalamus. Now, how does that happen is that if we enlarge the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus in a human, we get this picture. Now, this is the anterior lobe, while this is the posterior lobe or the posterior pituitary. Now, as you can easily see, that the axons come from both the arcuate nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus directly from the hypothalamus into the stalk and then into the tissue of the posterior pituitary. Now, in order to name these, we have this is the hypothalamus. So this area is the hypothalamus with its nuclei, with the optic chiasma and the third ventricular area. This is the infundibulum or the stalk of the pituitary gland, and this is the pituitary gland as whole, where only the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is shown. Now, this posterior pituitary gland does not produce any hormones on its own. Now, this is a very important distinction as compared to the anterior pituitary, because what happens is that we have a huge capillary plexus in the posterior pituitary, just like we have in the anterior pituitary. We have the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Now, hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract is a tract which is composed of the axons. Now, these axons have cell bodies in the nuclei of the hypothalamus. Now, these nuclei being the neurosecretory cells of the supraoptic nuclei and the neurosecretory cells of the paraventricular nucleus. Now, both of these nucleus produce separate hormones. Now, this produces the ADH or the antidiuretic hormone, while this one produces the oxytocin. Oxytocin has a variety of effects, from the delivery and labor to the contraction during the third trimester of the pregnancy. Now, both of these hormones, the ADH and oxytocin, both of these are synthesized in the nuclei of the hypothalamus. Now, these nuclei are the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus. And once these hormones have been synthesized, they move downwards into the infundibulum. Now, this movement happens through the axons in the exoplasm. So they move through the axons in the exoplasm inferiorly into the posterior pituitary. Now, when they are traveling through the infundibulum, the collection of the axons, which are then transporting the hormones which are produced by these nuclei, this is what is known as the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So this tract is nothing but a collection of the axons whose bodies or the cell bodies are found in the hypothalamic nuclei. Now, when these hormones produced travel downwards into the posterior pituitary, they do so through the axon and the exoplasm, and then they are released into the posterior pituitary. Now, when they are released in the posterior pituitary, now what happens is that the release is direct. Now, this direct release of both the oxytocin from this is direct. Now, what I mean by direct is that the exoplasm releases the hormones at the site of the plexus, and the plexus has a very peculiar structure that it contains sinusoids, which are the fenestrations or the holes in the plexus. So, whenever these synthesized hormones are released into the tissue of the posterior pituitary, they are immediately picked up by through the sinusoids into this vascular bed, and through this vascular bed they are collected and released all together through the hypophyseal vein of the posterior pituitary. So, to further elaborate, this one produces the oxytocin and this one produces the ADH or the antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone means diuresis means increase amount of water in urine. So antidiuretic hormone is the hormone which is against this phenomena or this diuresis. So with the effect of ADH, the concentration of the urine can be achieved because the amount of the water present in the urine is reduced with the release of the ADH. So both the oxytocin and the ADH are released because both of these are sent into the vascular bed, collected through the sinusoids, and then released by this one singular hypophyseal branch of the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, as for the pituitary gland, now this is a pituitary gland which you can easily identify because this one contains of the neuronal tissue. Now, like I said before, the anterior pituitary contains tissue which is of epithelium origin. That's why all the cells which compose the anterior pituitary are of the epithelioid in nature, while all the cells which are present in the posterior pituitary are of the neuronal origin because they are formed from the outpouching of the hypothalamus into the sella turcica, resulting in a posterior pouch or the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Now, we know that only two of the hormones are produced. One is the oxytocin, the other being the antidiuretic hormone. The function of the oxytocin is one, uterine muscles. It increases and controls the amount of the muscles which are present in the uterus. And its effect is exceptionally noticeable during the end of the third trimester of the pregnancy when it controls the contraction of the uterus and helps in the delivery of the baby. The other effect of oxytocin is on the mammary glands or the breasts because along with prolactin it helps in the growth of the breasts and the expression and the release of the milk after the delivery of the baby because the production of the milk starts before the delivery by the action of the prolactin, but it is the action of the oxytocin which causes the release of the milk after the delivery. Next is the ADH or the antidiuretic hormone. Now, this one affects the kidney tubules or otherwise known as the nephrons. Now, nephrons have a very undulating structure. They have a distal tubule, proximal tubule with a loop of Henle. Now, all of these tubules, especially the loop and the distal one, have special pores known as the aquaporins. Now, these aquaporins are very peculiar type of receptors or pores which only allow the entry of water. So, whenever ADH is released, the aquaporins are closed. So, water does not accumulate into the urine from the tubules and in turn urine is concentrated. So one of the effect of the ADH is not only to concentrate the urine, but it also is to conserve water in humans.